Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week I'm taking a trip down into the maintenance bay on a Star Cruiser for another obscure prop build. But this one is wielded by one of the franchise's most divisive characters. So let's get into it. While the character Rose Tico faced a lot of criticism, I thought her electro-shock prop was interesting. So I was really surprised to find a free 3D model of it on My Mini Factory, and without hesitation, I printed it on my resin printer and could get started on paint. Because all of these parts are relatively small, I decided to attach popsicle sticks to all of them with some double-sided carpet tape. This would act as both a handle as well as a spot to place a 1-2-3 block to make sure they don't tip over while I work. Once they were all adhered to the sticks, I could get to priming. As usual, I'm going with this U-Pole Expert Automotive Primer. It's not advertised as filler primer, but it does go on thick and dries much faster than other filler primers I've used in the past, which is saying something because it was pouring rain when I started on this project, so we'll see just how fast it actually dries. To help move things along, my shop hairdryer is getting a workout, but I'm making sure not to run it too hot or to get it too close to the surface to prevent solvent pop or blistering in the finish, even on the primer layer, because I don't plan on sanding this since the finish on the real prop looks a little chunky. When the primer was dry, I painted all of the parts in a matte black to give me a uniform base color that will also be good for painting a chrome-like finish over. If I'd had a high gloss black, this would have been the time to use it. Thankfully, I have some all-clad aqua gloss that I can apply to all of the parts that will get me to a shiny surface and eventually a more reflective finish. Off camera, I made myself a makeshift drying oven by placing the parts inside of a storage bin and loosely resting the hairdryer between the rim and the lid. I may look into a more permanent solution since this seemed to really help out. Once all the parts were dry, I could get to chrome. I'm using all-clad chrome for this project just to switch it up, especially since I didn't need a super high reflective surface, and I knew it would get dulled down in the end. That said, this chrome paint is still really good for these types of projects and is really easy to run through an airbrush. The 3D model included this knob, which based on the screen use prop photo looks to be made from brass. So I grabbed some antique gold rub and buff, applied a small amount to my finger, and lightly applied it to the part until it looked like a bit of scrap metal. This is one of those cases where I wanted a really inconsistent finish to give one of the few small parts of this device some much needed character. Next up on my painting to-do list is this stripe on the handle. Now it's hard to tell from the photo whether it's metallic or white, but since I already had the metallic paint in my airbrush, I went with it. But before I could add it, I'll do a bit of masking. Now typically I'd mask a part and then apply some clear coat to help seal the edges of the tape. But the paint job on the original is a little rough around the edges, so I'm going to throw caution to the wind and just paint it without the added protection. And since the paint dries quickly, I could remove the masking, and much to my surprise, the lines are nice and sharp. Since I'm already working on the grip section, I decided to apply some satin clear coat to it to lock in the chrome paint, as well as dull it down a bit so that it's a bit less reflective. This will also help with the weathering once I get to that part of the build. With the chrome paint dry, I can tackle the paint chipping effect using some liquid masking. I filled a small bottle with liquid latex and was able to draw on the areas where I want the paint chipping to be, although this got away from me a little bit in the process. I hadn't intended on going this heavy with the chipping, but sometimes you just have to listen to what the prop is telling you and go with it. If I were to do this again, I'd have used a fine tip brush to get a more detailed application of the liquid latex, so that I could more closely match the prop photo. But since this prop has a total of 15 seconds on screen, and only 5 of them are up close, I think it'll be okay. The liquid latex took some time to set up, but once it had, I was able to load my airbrush with this safety cone orange color and got to applying paint to the top and bottom grip pieces. I also taped off the 2 prods, and once the liquid masking was dry on them, they also got painted orange to match the other pieces. Then it was a bit more time under the hairdryer before I could remove the tape and then get into removing the liquid latex. This part is always fun. Watching the chrome paint appear out from underneath the masking really gives the prop its character, although admittedly, I was already thinking about how I would add smaller scrapes and scratches to help give it a less intentional appearance. But more on that in a minute. When all of the liquid latex had been removed from the parts, I could start my glue up. Since this will live in a vintage toy package, I'm not worried about it being handled, so I grabbed my CA glue and started to put everything together. The original prop has a small push button on the grip, which I assume came from a vintage indicator light, as well as a small metal round, which looked to me like a washer. So I glued in the washer and used a modern momentary push button cap for this detail, but sadly the camera was not rolling. But now that the camera is rolling, I can get to adding a bit more wear to my paint with a bamboo skewer. The skewer is the perfect choice for this step because it's a softer point than a razor blade, so I don't have to worry about scraping down to the raw print. This approach will allow me to make small changes to the existing chipping to help it look more organic in a less destructive way. At this point, the grip itself was looking a bit flat, so I decided to accent it with a bit of dry brushing. Now, since I assumed this whole thing was likely metal, I chose pewter rub and buff, and went as light as I possibly could, trying to just hit the high spots of the textured grip, in hopes that it would make it stand out a bit more and prevent it from really getting lost once I do any weathering. For the weathering on this prop, I'll be using this burnt umber airbrush paint, and we'll dab it off with a damp sea sponge. And in between passes, I help speed up the drying with my hairdryer. Longtime viewers will know that this isn't my typical approach, but because of the high humidity and the fact that I've already got my airbrush out, this is the best method for the job. Because the paints are water-based, I was also able to use a damp Q-tip for any small touch-ups where the paint was a bit heavy, and when I was happy with how it looked, I left it to dry. The last bit of painting for this prop is the heat discoloration at the end of the prods. Typically, you'd use more transparent paints for this, but since I didn't have any, I decided to just use my standard paints and figured I could always remove it if I didn't like how it looked. I started with blue along the top, followed by a bit of purple made from adding red to the remaining blue paint in the airbrush. Then I followed up with yellow, and lastly a small amount of red between the yellow and purple bands. It wasn't perfect, but I think it'll work. You may also notice I added in the red and black wire leads to the taller prod. These were cut off from an LED bulb and worked perfectly with a bit of glue to hold them in place. The final step for this prop was to scuff up the weathering with a Scotch-Brite pad, followed by some final adjustments with another damp Q-tip. This just adds a bit more texture to everything. Off camera, I added in the 4 M3 button head screws to the front of the grip, and this electro-shock prod prop was done. Now, while the sequel movies may have their flaws, the props department did a great job in carrying on the visual language of the earlier films, and this prop is a great example that I'm happy to have in my collection. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. But most importantly, go make something.